the standpoint of Heimatlosigkeit and the planet. And now to chair this session, please welcome back Professor Sebastian Liao, Dean of IHS NTU, and our speaker is Professor Yuk HUI, Professor of Philosophy and Chair of Human Conditions at Erasmus University, Rotterdam in Netherlands. Please welcome Professor Liao and Professor Hui to the stage.
Now we come to the last session of today's symposium. Last but not, of course, least, because Professor Yuk HUI, or in Mandarin, Yuk HUI, is probably one of the, I would say, maybe the best Chinese philosopher of his generation. Yeah, definitely the best. And he's not only very well known in Asia, but also in Europe. He's actually he I think caught people's attention first in Europe. Not least because he was a student of Bernard Stiegler. Professor Yuk HUI is also a very close personal friend, and whom I admire very much. He is currently a professor of philosophy and chair of human conditions at the Erasmus University, Rotterdam. He wrote his doctoral thesis under French philosophy, like I said, Bernard Stiegler, at Goldsmiths College London, and obtained his habilitation from Leuphana University Lunenburg. He's the author of several monographs that have been translated into 1,000 languages, including On the Existence of Digital Objects, 2016, The Question Concerning Technology in China, an essay in Cosmotechnics, 2016, Recursivity and Contingency, 2019, Art in Cosmotechnics, 2021, Machine and Sovereignty, 2024, and forthcoming Kant and Machine. Professor Yuk HUI has been a juror of Bernd Gouen Prize for Philosophy and Culture since 2020, and convener of the Research Network for Philosophy and Technology since 2014. And today he's going to speak on the topic, the standpoint of Heimatlosigkeit and planet. Now, without further ado, let's give Professor Yuk HUI, sorry, a big applause.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. I would really like to thank Sebastian for his invitation and for making possible that I participate in this symposium. I regret that I met him very late in 2023, in the summer in Portugal, in Lisbon. But in this short period, we have a lot of exchange, and I'm always impressed by his open-mindedness, his curiosity, but also, most importantly, his sincerity and his generosity. But today I don't have enough time to admire him, because otherwise I cannot finish my own talk. So I will go directly to the question of post-rest. As it was said, it was already asked this morning, and we have heard so, that the term post-rest, or even rest, carries many connotations. Most obviously, it's expressed in the slogan, the decline of the West and the rise of the East. Where if you read a newspaper, you probably saw it very often. Does post-West mean moving away from a Western-Centrism towards an Eastern-Centrism, or even a Sinocentrism? I'm afraid this might be something happening. Or does it mean a multipolar world, such as the Russian traditionalist and conservative thinker Alexander Dugin has been calling, and which has been echoed elsewhere in the world? Is Eastern-Centrism or multipolar world a response to our situation today? I would rather suggest that we have to start from elsewhere in order to avoid repeating the tragic history of the 20th century, especially at the moment when geopolitics is extremely unstable and it has become a politics of technologies, considering the development of AI and microchips in Taiwan, for example. Now, this starting point consists of two key terms. One is homelessness, or Heimatlosigkeit in German, and I will explain why I use the term in German later. And the second is the planet, as you can see from the title, and I would like to elaborate in the next 30 minutes. But first of all, let me start with a quote from Martin Heidegger's 1947 letter on humanism. We read here, "Homelessness or Heimatlosigkeit is coming to be the destiny of the world." It's also something that I use, that based on the interpretation of this quote, I developed this small book called The Post-Europe, published last year. So some of the things I'm going to talk about will be from this small book, Post-Europe, because I think it resonates with post-West. But of course, Europe is not exactly West. And actually, we cannot really pin down what is West. It's too complex. This prediction, that's to say homelessness, from Heidegger's letter on humanism, has arrived through a process which he calls planetarization. Planetarization. This planetarization implies a long history of human technical activities, including plantation, colonization, globalization, and now we arrive at a time that the Earth appears to be a stranger to us. Not only because of the climate changes and the ecological crisis everywhere, but also the Earth becomes an object of design, subject to geoengineering, to space technologies. Hannah Arendt, in her 1958, The Human Condition, starts by claiming that the Sputnik marked the most significant scientific event in the first half of the 20th century, not second to the splitting of atom. That's to say nuclear energy. Unfortunately, Hannah Arendt didn't explore further the implication of this in her book. It only appears on the first page and then it's gone. A few years later, Martin Heidegger saw the image of the Earthrise sent from the Lunar Orbiter 1 right before his famous interview with Der Spiegel. And it was published 10 years later with the title, "Only a God Can Save Us." And being shocked, we read in the interview a famous verdict from Heidegger, which claims that philosophy is succeeded by cybernetics. When he was asked, what comes after philosophy? He replied, cybernetics. In the end of philosophy and the task of thinking, Heidegger already claimed that cybernetics marks the end of Western philosophy and metaphysics. So Western philosophy and metaphysics is completed in cybernetics, because end, das Ende, means also completion. Cybernetics is the completion of Western philosophy. So that's the first meaning of the end of philosophy. Now he explains further the second meaning of the end of philosophy. But this second meaning was very often ignored. I rarely saw Heideggerians, I'm not Heideggerian, I rarely saw Heideggerians talk about this. the second meaning of the end of philosophy is the following. The end of philosophy means the beginning of the world civilization based on Western European thinking. Now, it's rather shocking. The end of philosophy means the beginning of the world civilization based on Western European thinking. However, this is logical, in the sense that if cybernetics means the completion of Western philosophy, and that cybernetics is adopted everywhere in the world, including this microphone I'm using, this computer I'm using, then the world civilization will enter a phase that is based on Western European thinking. So when we talk about post-Europe, it only means that we are already all European, or when we say post-Western, it also means that we are already all Western. What Heidegger said in the 1960s was already anticipated in the 1930s, when the question of technology became a central theme, and we also witnessed the famous turn, the famous Kehr in Heidegger's thought. In the 1930s, Heidegger already claimed that this planetarization implies a planetary lack of sense-making, Besinnungslosigkeit. This inability to be aware of something, of the process itself. And it is not limited to Europe, but also, for example, applicable to the United States and to Japan. What Heidegger says is clear, because since modernization, and I think later maybe we want to enter into a conversation, what does it mean by modernity and modernization? Asian countries have undergone a process of Europeanization and later Americanization, or we can simply call it Westernization, in the past 2 centuries. However, I will only limit my experience to East Asia, because I have to admit that I don't know so much about Asia at all. I can tell you a story. 2022, I was taking a taxi in Poland, in Russia. I was on the way to the airport, and the driver was complaining to me about the corruption in Poland. And he said, Poland is so corrupt like Asia. And I didn't know what to say. I was silent. And then the taxi driver said, "Oh no, I mean Kazakhstan. I didn't mean Korea or Japan." But you see that Asia, how little we know about Asia, how different our imaginations are. So I will limit myself to the very little thing I know. The rapid modernization towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, largely driven by war and colonial struggle, led to a transformation of society and the spirit. The rhetoric on the decline of the West has led to the reflection and reservation on the adaptation of Western civilization and its process of modernization. The decline of the West also implies a resentment of the fact that Europe is no longer the center and the central power of the world. And that drove the whole discourse about new international relations, notably in the work of Carl Schmitt that was mentioned this morning. Oswald Spengler wrote of course famous for the decline of the West, but he wrote in another book titled Men and Techniques, in which he lamented that at the close of last century, the blind will to power began to make its decisive mistakes. Instead of keeping strictly to itself the technical knowledge that constitutes their greatest asset, the white peoples complacently offered it to all the world in every Hochschule, verbally and on paper. And the astonished homage of Indians and Japanese delighted them. As a result, he continues, the Japanese became, I quote, technicians of the first rank, and in the 1904-1905 war against Russia, they revealed a technical superiority from which their teachers were able to learn many lessons, but such as we have seen in the work of Masaki. What does it mean, the decline of the West to the East? What does it mean by that to the East? We were reminded by Carl Löwit, who spent 5 years in Japan right before the war, that we can read here. Europe is a concept that does not originate from itself, but from its essential antithesis to Asia. Europe is originally, as long as it remains true to itself, politically and spiritually, an anti-Asian power. He wrote this during his stay in Japan. If modernization means the importation of the European decadence for the Asian intellectuals, especially the Japanese intellectual at the time, then the East is in crisis, in permanent crisis. A crisis that is double in the sense that firstly, it embodies the crisis of Europe, expressed in various domains such as science, philosophy, religion, etc. If you read literatures of the 20th century, you find crisis in mathematics, crisis in science, with Rousseau, crisis in religion, crisis in culture, everything, many crises. Crisis of the spirit, of course, if you talk about Paul Valéry. Secondly, it embodies the crisis originating from a seemingly irresolvable conflict between tradition and modern, a melancholia which will return from time to time to haunt the subject in question. Therefore, in between 1941 and 1942, 3 symposiums organized by the magazine Shuo Konron took place with the participation of 4 Kyoto School philosophers. The first symposium took place in November 1941, where about 83 years from now, and preceded another famous symposium, Overcoming Modernity, organized by another magazine, Bungakukai. So this Overcoming Modernity gathers many people such as writers, musicians, historians, philosophers to discuss how to overcome Western or European modernity. But there are also in parallel where 3 other symposiums took place as a series. And the first of these symposiums was titled The Standpoint of World History and Japan. So you can see here the first 3 are organized by Shuo Konron. The last one is organized by Bungakukai. In this symposium, the first symposium, a message was clearly expressed. The world history has been shaped by the West. But with the decline of the West, world history has to be rewritten from a new perspective, namely the standpoint of Japan. What does it mean to post-West? Well, they're not already proposing something we call post-West today. The economy of the spirit was firstly systematically formulated by Hegel in his series of writings on the Geist, the spirit. The world history is the journey of the world spirit, which originated from the Orient and traveled to Greece and flourished in the West. Thus Sebastian mentioned about this in the morning. The journey of the spirit is a spirit towards the concrete universal, namely reason, Vernunft. Hegel's discourse was very powerful, not because of this funny character called the spirit, but because the world history is understood as a history of reason, meaning that what is irrational will be left behind, and reason will march towards the absolute, the concrete universal. The decline of the West also means the disorientation of reason. Disorientation means here both losing one's direction and losing one's place. East, West, Occident, Orient, Morgenland, Abendland. So the title of the talk, The Standpoint of Japan and World History, mirrors this talk, the standpoint of homelessness, of Heimatlosigkeit and the planet. The German word Heimat means both fatherland, Vaterland, and homeland. It is the place to which one belongs. One should find his or her own root. In 1941, the standpoint of Japan was a response to this Heimatlosigkeit, to this disorientation of the East in face of its rampant modernization. And therefore, it seems a return to a homeland is a resistance. And such a return is also a rewriting of the world history, the journey of reason. So that's why when Okamoto went back, he thought that he wanted to return to his homeland. Today, we cannot deny that it was both a political and philosophical task, whose weights continue to grow when we look at what is happening. The re-emergence or the intensification of fascism that we are witnessing today, and that remind us of what already happened almost 100 years ago among the Kyoto school philosophers. In the recent decades, we heard many times clichés such as decline of the West, rise of the East, clashes of civilizations, and the return to Heimat was not only expressed in China's desire of the renaissance of a Chinese nation, or that of a Slav nation of Russia, but also the rise of extreme right in Germany, France, Netherlands, and beyond, but also in the MAGA movement of the United States, which has recently shaken the geopolitics. Therefore, we shouldn't be too surprised by the recent victory of Donald Trump and the escalation of wars. They are witness to the unhappy consciousness. Unhappy consciousness is an impasse in the journey of the spirit, as Hegel has described in the Phenomenology of the Spirit. Unhappy consciousness is the moment when one is aware of the contradiction, and in this case, the contradiction of globalization, while not being able to resolve it and move forward. So you have to return, you have to go back. And that's what we're witnessing today. Heimatlosigkeit, homelessness, is a phenomenon that is brought about by the technological planetarization, but also the globalization process which made immigration a significant phenomenon in the past century. At the same time, the real estate speculation facilitated by the neoliberal capitalism has accelerated this process and rendered it a generalized phenomenon of our time. And if in European metropolitan cities, as well as in Asia, for the younger generation, it's almost impossible to buy a place, not even to pay the rent. Now, the situation has radically changed in the past 10 years. However, instead of repeating this attempted return to the Heimat that we have seen among the Kyoto school philosophers, as well as the politicians of our time, it is necessary to change our standpoint, not from the Heimat, but rather from the very facts of Heimatlosigkeit, of homelessness. Even though there is always a melancholia which can never be fully cured. A kind of Heimatlosigkeit that is shared by everyone who is dwelling and will continue dwelling on this earth. By saying so, we must keep in mind that such a return to the Heimat is a reaction to the process of planetarization which we witness today and which we cannot simply negate because it is also a world destiny. World history will have to be written, but it has to be written from a different starting point or different standpoint. Now, I mirrored world history with planet, with homelessness, and Japan with planet, not merely as an anti-Hegelian discourse, but also an invitation to expand the concept of the spirit, hence also the concept of reason. If world history is also the history of reason, it was too much associated with one nation, with one place, with the dogmas that one carries without being aware of them. Reason has to be expanded. In the sense of Kant's Erweiterung, expansion or epigenesis of reason. And I think if we have the time, we can come back to what Kant says in What is the Enlightenment, and the necessity of considering the expansion of reason. Because there's no such thing called reason, there's only epigenesis of reason, and this is very clear in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason afterward. That's to say that you will not be bounded to a limit that is imposed on it by a certain rationality and values. The planet is a place where a recognition of diversity and a conceptualization of universality, or a reconceptualization of universality, should take off. The fact that Europe ceased to be the center of the world was taken up by the phenomenologist Jan Patočka, and he coined it as post-Europe, nach Europa. Post-Europe not only indicates a fact, but also a necessary task for the Europeans as well, to look for a thinking that is adequate to address the post-European situation. For Patočka, as well as for Heidegger, even though there's some difference between them, such a post-European future is a return to the Greece. For Heidegger, it's the return to what the Greeks called being, sein. And for Patočka, it's a return to the care of the soul foregrounded by Plato. So, for him, a post-European philosophy means a return to the care of the soul that was already announced by Plato. These therapies prescribed for the psychological laws of Europe is in contrast with the New Age practice, exemplified by the California Zen in the last century. These attempts result in what Peter Sloterdijk called Euro-Taoism. Euro-Taoism. So I don't know if you wrote about Euro-Taoism in your book to be published. A phenomenon he witnessed and participated during his youth. He went to practice yoga, but also Indian mysticism in India. However, like all his precursors, Sloterdijk has to admit that even if we recognize Eastern wisdom as an impressive and singular greatness, Asian impulse alone will not save the Western mobilized world. The initiative of Americo-Taoism is thus that a response to the crisis of the West by importing holistic fast food from the Far East. It was almost the same gesture when Martin Heidegger refused that Buddhism can be an antidote to the malaise of the West. Instead, adopting Buddhism will only speed up the uprooting in Europe, according to Heidegger. What might be the response from the East today? Are we going to mirror what the West has been struggling? Heidegger tried to open such a question in the West with what he called thinking, denken, a thinking that is no longer the continuation of Western philosophy, because the latter is already completed in cybernetics, as we have seen. What is called thinking is the thinking of being, the thinking of this being which was already pronounced in the time of the Pisocratics, but it was not yet thought through in the history of European philosophy. Will the East continue responding with the question of nothing, the absolute nothingness, made popular by the Kyoto School? Or is the East going to use Tao against Logos? Are these efforts not falling back to the search of Heimat, like what happened in the 20th century? Most of the anti-West discourses were actually repetition of Western discourse. Like what Mignolo said when he said that when everyone's talking about decolonization, they immediately trying to establish a nation state. I would suggest that the task of thinking is not to search what is thinking, was heißt denken, as Heidegger was trying to say, but rather to think along the line which I called the individuation of thinking. Individuation is a concept that many philosophers address throughout the history of philosophy, that almost in every major philosopher we can find discussions about individuation. But here I refer more precisely to what the French philosopher Gilbert Simondon's concept of individuation. And this morning when Radha talked about Etienne Balibar and the trans-individual, that individuation is at the same time psychic and collective. Actually, it was from Simondon, because Etienne was his student. To briefly explain what it means by that, I allow myself to simplify it, and I want to warn you that I simplify it. Now, for individuation to take place, that's to say, for an individual to come into being, it presupposes tensions and incompatibilities in the system. For example, in a supersaturated solution, when the tensions between positive ions and negative ions reaches a threshold, the solution starts losing its structure, and new structure will be produced in order to arrive at what Simondon calls a metastable status. Metastable in the sense that it is not equilibrium, it's not identity, because it still carries potential with it in order to individuate in the future when conditions are satisfied. In other words, individuation presupposes incompatibility or even oppositional forces within the system as its very condition or possibility. Individuation of thinking is something that Simondon himself didn't explore. However, it has to be elaborated and understood as an urgent task, because it is neither the origin of the West nor the origin of the East will help us to move out of this planetary condition of all the crises that we are confronting. It is not only because no ancient philosopher in the East and West could have anticipated our situation today, but also any return to the origin risks a repetition of the tragic but seductive events of the 20th century. How could we elaborate then on this task of the individuation of thinking today? I want to emphasize that individuation of thinking is not a melange, it's not a simple hybridization in any sense. It is also not what is called comparative philosophy nor post-colonial discourse. These two have been the major strategies in the past decades to challenge the universal. The former, meaning comparative philosophy, looks for compatibilities and common ground between different thought. The later, post-colonial discourse, discrediting Europe as the standard of civilization or the place of universality. However, thinking also stagnates in comparison and in attempts to provincialize Europe. Individuation of thinking instead always look for incompatibility. So individuation demands tensions and incompatibility, which is, maybe we can say, comparable to what François Julien calls a gap. A gap. It is a gap which resists comparison and elimination of differences. For such a gap, which sometimes appears to be oppositional, we have to serve as a springboard for which thinking can produce a quantum leap towards individuation. And in this sense, we are aiming at here is beyond what Yoshimi Takeuchi and Yuzo Mizoguchi have done in their proposal to consider Asia and China as a method. Now, if you remember that Takeuchi wrote an essay called Asia as Method, and Mizoguchi wrote a book called China as a Method in the 80s. Mozon-san and Nishida Kitaro are the pioneers who have attempted to facilitate such a possibility of the individuation of thinking. Now, I cannot go into detail here into Mozon-san, but I will only briefly mention why I think that they demonstrate this. Mozon-san, by identifying Western thought with the Kantian phenomenon and Chinese thought with noumenon, this divide we find in the first critique, tries to produce a thinking which is able to comprehend both of them. Nishida, by identifying Western philosophy with the question of being and Eastern thought with the question of nothing, produces a thinking that resolves the opposition as in his logic of basho, of place. Now, it's pointless to criticize their thought being inauthentic and not being loyal to any tradition, because what they were aiming at is not any authenticity of thinking, but rather what I called individuation of thinking. In the 21st century, this leap towards individuation and through individuation should be made sensible not only through writings, such as what Mozon-san and Nishida have done, but rather it will have to be realized in a culture that is able to integrate technology instead of seeing culture as opposed to technology, such as tradition to modern, and instead of seeing technology as that which determines culture, such as technological determinism. Because if we agree that technology is what brought us to this planetary condition, anything that circumscribes the question of technology will be deemed to fail. I feel that in the past century, the marginalization of Eastern thought in the landscape of contemporary thinking was largely because it cannot, and in some cases, it even refuses to engage with modern technology. It is in this distancing from technology that it renders itself irrelevant, besides of comparative studies. The British historian Arnold Toynbee raised an interesting question in his 1952 rate lectures for the BBC. The question is the following: why did the Chinese and Japanese refuse European visitors in the 16th century, but allow them to enter their countries in the 19th century? Toynbee's answer was that in the 16th century, the Europeans wanted to export both religion, Christianity, and technology to East Asia. And the East Asians realized that that would mean a change in their form of life. Now, towards the end of the 17th century, according to Toynbee, something happened in Europe. Technology and religion became separated, or they cut into this. There was a split. In the 19th century, when the Europeans understood that it was more effective to just export technology without Christianity, then the Asian countries easily accepted technology was something inessential and only instrumental, and that they were users who could decide how to use these technologies. Now, Toynbee considered a miscalculation. What Toynbee was saying is that technology in itself is nothing neutral. It carries particular form of knowledge, especially ontologies called epistemology and ontology, as well as practice, with which it obliges its users to comply. If one does not take this into consideration, one is liable to adopt a rather dualist approach, undermining the importance of technology by treating it as merely something instrumental. Now, we can read what he says quickly. Technology operates on the surface of life, and therefore it seems practicable to adopt a foreign technology without putting oneself in danger of ceasing to be able to call oneself to one's own. This notion that in adopting a foreign technology one is incurring only a limited liability may, of course, be a miscalculation. In Asia, during this period, we find very similar slogans such as Chinese substance and Western function, Japanese soul and Western knowledge, Eastern Tao and Western Qi. You find this in 3 East Asian countries. Now, all of these movements share the conviction that Eastern thinking will be able to master Western science and technology, which are mere instruments. Today, those familiar with the criticism of dualism and modernity know that this wishful thinking was only a variation of Cartesian dualism and is doomed to fail because it was a product of early modernity. Therefore, the individuation of thinking will have to take place in a different terrain, and will have to distance itself from the discourse of the 20th century, which see technology as a threat to culture and civilization, while at the same time you will also have to resist the homogenization of the technological planetarization, which is precisely the source of the generalized homelessness today. Technological planetarization does not recognize locality, that's to say, place, because its operational scheme is space. This means that we have to read Eastern thinking from the perspective of technology, but also to read technology from the perspective of Eastern thought, in order to rediscover thinkings that could intervene into the technological world. And by doing so, we can also discover the eckart, the gap between different thought of technology in different places in the world, so that a thinking that is adequate to the current process of planetarization could emerge. Being adequate means being contemporary to it. In other words, you will have to see from the standpoint of Heimatlosigkeit, homelessness, a completion which calls for a new kind of thinking. This new thinking neither comes from the West nor the East, but only through the individuation situating in the technological world. I would like to conclude this by reading a kind of fictional conversation made by Heidegger. He met a Japanese scholar, but what was published was partly fictional. Incura is Heidegger. Here you are touching on a controversial question, which I often discussed with Count Kuki, social Kuki. The question whether it is necessary and rightful for East Asians to chase after the European conceptual systems. Now, I think we talked about this in the opening of Sebastian, the Japanese visitor. In the face of modern technization and industrialization of every continent, there will seem to be no escape any longer. You speak cautiously, you say, would seem. Visitor, indeed, for the possibility still always remains that, seen from the point of view of our East Asian existence, the technical world which sweeps us alone must confine itself to surface matters and that. And thus Heidegger, that for this reason a true encounter with European existence is still not taking place, in spite of all assimilations and intermixtures. But that may be something for Masaki. So how could we move forward from this on? I don't have time to elaborate, but I tried to analyze this in another book published last year called The Machine and Sovereignty, a book that was largely a kind of engagement or discussion with Hegel and Carl Schmitt. I dedicated 2 chapters to Carl Schmitt on the question of epistemology. Then I tried to propose a new way to think about, a new configuration to think about how to move forward, and this consists in a matrix. It includes a kind of interrelated techno-diversity, new diversity, meaning diversity of thinking, the noesis, and biodiversity. However, I will just mention about this because Sebastian mentioned about this this morning, but unfortunately I don't think I have time to go deeper into that. But I wanted to make to explain that with the individuation of thinking in mind, the effort is to rethink about difference and rethink about the production and reproduction of diversities. Now, a question that came to me in the morning, there was someone in the classroom asked me, is that when we talk about epistemologies, I think including the talk of Buddha, are we not promoting a kind of relativism, a cultural relativism? My answer is no. Because I think our understanding of universalism opposed to relativism is very unsophisticated. I think the true universal to come, we have to start with the question of diversity, with the question of difference. But the planetarization that we observe today is very much based on the homogenization of technological, whether brought about by technological globalization. So that will be, this serves as a beginning to reflect on what Sebastian would call post-West. So I think I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thrifty on words, but so enlightening. Yeah, thank you very much. The floor is open. Any questions?
It's my duty to ask the first question and get things started. I want to ask some question about the homelessness and how it can be applied. One, with technology, okay, more people using, let's just say, for example, the cell phone and the internet. People use it and it empowers them, but at the same time it is controlling them, and they don't know how it works. I mean, for the first time, we're filled with machines and technology in which you need to be an absolute specialist to have any clue of how it works. And for people who have perceived themselves as intellectuals, this is totally disempowering, because suddenly you don't know how things work anymore. So to me, the whole technical virtual world is a kind of homelessness. Now, to counter that, Ursula Heise, an eco-critic who's going to be coming to Taiwan shortly, has written about the sense of planet, and that our sense of home now is shifting to one as planetary. Now, I know you weren't using planetary in that sense, but as we move away maybe from nation state, we can gather some steam as planet as home.
You mentioned it in briefing, but I would be very interested to know what do you think the function of migration in this system, that migration, the movement of people, that is very now pronounced also in this discussion about the decline of, sort of like the decline of Europe. So how do you see this kind of, the movement of people in the promotion of, let's say, new diversity or techno-diversity or biodiversity?
Classical musician, so studied in Austria, so Heidegger is very familiar for us. I'd like to ask you about the Heimatlosigkeit, and you know that Heidegger went through 2 World War. So you know the musician who also wrote many good music, very good music. One of the most famous one was Wagner and Hans Eisler and Kreisler and so. And my question is about, since Heimatlosigkeit, Heidegger mentioned also about the Unheimlichkeit, and this too has to do very much with the war. So I just like to ask you about today, in this phenomenon of today's, are we, since you are talking about this technology, and so what the art and music can do at this new era?
What I'm going to do is I'm going to answer all these questions together, regardless of order. So first of all, I think that maybe we start from because I think some of the questions are really interrelated. Because when Heidegger calls a planetarization, you know, he already talked about it in the 1930s. But we can think of it as kind of the spread of technologies throughout the globe. And it's not only about mobile phones, about internet, but also about mining, deforestation. And these are really transforming the earth. People are kicked out of their place, and they have to immigrate, they have to move to other cities and so on. And also there is a rapid transformation of life in the rural areas where there's a kind of urbanization of villages and so on. And all this brought about what Heidegger would call kind of Heimatlosigkeit. But also immigration, as you said, immigration. That today, if you look at what is happening in Europe, you know, the voice against immigration and so on are so strong now that people would blame that the health system is destroyed because of migration of immigrants and so on and so forth. So I think that the situation that Heidegger had seen in the 1930s on is only more and more intensified today. It's more and more intensified today. And what is so problematic is that at this moment, in this moment, what we are witnessing, we are confronting, is like some déjà vu, like something we have seen. And how are we going to respond to this? Are we going to repeat? Is the East going to repeat what the West has done, or are we going to fall victim to kind of propaganda or ideological propaganda that is well circulated throughout the world? So it's again this context that I want to talk about. I want to say that the solution is not stepping back to look for the Heimat, but rather maybe we should start from there, from homelessness, and think what else can we do? What might be the other options, other paths? And the one possibility, because especially when I think about my own discipline, is individuation of thinking. something I try to contrast with what Heidegger calls thinking. I want to move away from the search of what is thinking in Heidegger and to think what is individuation of thinking. And how this individuation of thinking actually could allow us to enlarge the kind of diversities that we have. I mean, regarding your question, migration and exchange of knowledge and so on, how could this allow us to even diversify our technological thinking? Because I think when I proposed this theory, I said they're interrelated in the sense that today we cannot really talk about biodiversity as it is something, there is something objectively there and we protect. You know, this object, something outside of us, and biodiversity as the so-called nature outside of us, because we live with these species. And our interaction with the environment, with the non-humans, actually are different from one place to another. And it's also with the kind of the different way of thinking, or the new diversity, we have to be supported by techno-diversity, but the question of practice, as what Ruda said this morning, that it's through practice that the new diversity, new practice in the sense that the use of technology, invention of technology, that the new diversity could be preserved and that the biodiversity could be maintained, not only maintained, but also cultivated. Now, lastly, just, I know time out, but very briefly, what could art and music do? Well, I do think that there are I do think that both music and art play a very important role in early on what I called the expansion of reason, the Erweiterung of reason. And I think that when Sebastian this morning, when he said, where he invoked Kant by his limited reason and kind of present the hierarchy of reason, I actually think that Kant is more complicated than that, because, you know, this kind of racist statement you find in many people in that period. You find in Kant, you find in Hegel, when Hegel said the Slavs and the Poles, they contributed nothing to the world spirit. You know, you remember about that, even though they said that, you know, the Slav, even though they helped Europe, but they don't contribute to the spirit, to the world spirit. But we need to return to the question of reason and to think how can we expand reason. Now, I cannot elaborate, but I want to, in terms of arts and music, I want to introduce a concept I called the non-rational. The non-rational. Now, we have a rational, we have irrational, but we also have a non-rational. So the non-rational is one entry point where we can really expand what we call reason. And when we fall victim to the opposition between rational and irrational, then we are basically subsumed to what is called to the dictatorship of the scientific technological manipulation. So how can we talk about the non-rational? This morning, rather talk about the unknown. The unknown for me is also a kind of, where the non-rational is always unknown, because you cannot demonstrate what it is. You cannot describe what exactly it is. It might also relate to what Sebastian called the re-enchantment of the world. The re-enchantment of the world. Because if there were a disenchantment of the world, because something was eliminated. And what is eliminated is not only superstition. I mean, of course, it might be a good idea to remove that. But in this process, also the non-rational, the unknown were removed. And I think because Wagner was the person who who excited Nietzsche by trying to kind of re-establish the German culture through music, to bring in the Dionysian drive back to the German spirit through the ceremony. And that's why the preface of the first edition of Birth of Tragedy was dedicated to Wagner. But that would be too much to elaborate. So thank you very much for the questions.
Well, thank you, Yuk, so much for giving us during this very brief session. I was wrong in saying that I was imprecise in saying that he's 50 on his words. He actually is not, but he's very accurate on his words, precise. He's like in Flaubert, le mot juste. You always have to be very precise. And I suggest that you read his book on post-Europe, because he basically based his talk on that book, when you're reading that book, things would become very, very clear to you. Yeah. But don't leave us yet. So we have a roundtable right after this. There's no break. So if you have any other questions or ideas want to exchange, we have 1 more hour. So right now we'll begin the roundtable session.